Great, thank you for coming back. We're going to go to the next session now and think about what is Owen's congregational theory. So if you remember yesterday we talked about the context for Owen's congregationalism. Today we're thinking about the theory and then the practice of his congregationalism, and I'm going to very briefly touch on a couple of things that we've talked about with Zach and with Martin, and then we're going to move forward into the 1660s. So remember how I began yesterday. Sorry, I should just say as well, there's my email address. If you'd like a copy of these slides, please email me. I'll be really happy to send that to you, although it might be next week when I get back home and get a chance to get organised. So yesterday, I began the presentation by talking about the dangers of looking for a usable past, trying to find precedents in history that can validate or confirm views that we hold today. And I want to really reiterate that. Doug has emphasised this. I want to reiterate it again now, because one of the things we're going to see is that Owen's position changes over time. That's, I suppose, a basic thing that historians look for, is change over time. How do things end up the way they are? And what we might notice after lunch is that Owen's position in practice doesn't necessarily adhere to any of his positions in theory. It may or it may not. And I also want to emphasise this is not a problem. Because as long as Owen agrees with you once, he's right. And, you know, if you can find anything here, as we talked about yesterday, you know, there is development, we do grow, we do change. And we will see as we look at Owen's positions in theory and practice that he is constantly responding to the circumstances in which he is based. His core convictions don't necessarily change, but his emphases often do. And he is moving from positions of almost anarchy, ecclesiastical anarchy, through a time of order into a time of really extraordinary persecution. And his thinking about the church is going to track that broader social political environment. So, just by way of very, very quick recap, you know how Owen's position changes in theory. He starts out as an Anglican, ordained as a deacon and priest in the 1630s. He is briefly a Presbyterian in the 1640s, but remember, this is a Presbyterian before the Westminster Assembly has really defined a national confession of faith or catechisms that we would use today as principal markers of Presbyterian conviction. He then becomes a Congregationalist, as Martin reminded us, in the 1650s, but in a role, I'm not sure, Martin, can we call it Erastian? Maybe that's not the best term, you can correct me over lunch. But he's got a state view, he's looking at the church from the state's perspective and trying to think about how to manage it in the way that Martin just beautifully described. Then, in the period we're going to think most about today, the 1660s and beyond, he's moving into his experience of defeat. In the 1660s and beyond, I think we see Owen at his best. In the earlier period, we might see Owen at his most. In the 1660s and beyond, I think we see him at his best, because it's when facing the pressures of persecution that the real commitments, I think, really rise to the surface. And if you ever struggle to read Owen, I know we often do, one of the best places to start with Owen is Volume 9 of the Banner of Truth set, which is the sermons he preaches to a persecuted people. And if you read those, they are simple, they are warm, they are clear, they are focused on the gospel, and they are full of encouragement and hope. So that's where you want to begin. Volume 9, if the other stuff is a bit too much, think about Volume 9. And the Volume 9 stuff is what we're really going to be thinking about today. Zach, in his great presentation, first of all this morning, emphasised Owen is not doing his thinking in a vacuum. There's all kinds of influences coming on him, political ideas, constitutional convictions, and so on. When Owen comes to congregational views in the 1640s, his early connections are with New England. Obviously, he reads Cotton's Keys in 1644. In 1646, Owen leaves his first Essex parish of Fordham, and he's replaced by a man called John Bulkeley, who is one of the first graduates of Harvard College. That's who Owen is replaced by. And so when Owen moves to Cogswell, his next door neighbour in the Fordham parish is a Harvard graduate. And then when Owen is at Cogswell, he brings into the leadership of that particular congregation a man called John Sams, John Sams has also been in New England. And so Owen is surrounding himself in Essex with men who have been in that part of the world. And that connection continues to be important for Owen in the period that we're going to look at today. Robert Newman, who works with Owen in 1659 when the state is collapsing and they're doing their best to retain religious liberty as the revolution seems to crumble and the monarchy seems inevitably to return. Robert Newman, who also becomes a member of Owen's congregation in the 1670s in Leadenhall Street, London, it was in Robert Newman's barn that the town of New Haven, Connecticut was covenanted. So when I talked yesterday about the ways in which people think about chartered companies, creating chartered towns, creating covenanted congregations, Robert Newman is just a great example of exactly that in action. So Owen's early influences are very much those of New England, whether it's Cotton, whether it's Bulky, his next door neighbour, whether it's Sams, who becomes essentially a co-elder, or whether it's in some of his later friendships like that with Robert Newman. So often we think about Owen in relation to the dissenting brethren. The men have come back from the Netherlands with these radical, really anarchic set of ideas, and we position Owen with those men, but he's not. He's meeting them socially, he's working with them organisationally, but his thinking is really drawing on the more ordered, more balanced type of congregational theory that's coming across the Atlantic from New England. Zach reminded us this morning that one of Owen's earliest publications is The Duty of Pastors and People Distinguished. It's his book as a Presbyterian, remember, but it's a book that doesn't really deal with the big issue between Presbyterians and Independents, which is the power over the congregation of an extra-congregational body, the authority of synods. And Owen is quoting in that book the learned Rutherford, Samuel Rutherford, the great Scottish Presbyterian theologian, and in his early writing he is depending, he thinks, on Rutherford and other Scottish points of reference to develop several theological points which he later abandons. And of course another one of those points he learns from Rutherford and later abandons is the idea that an atonement is not necessary for the forgiveness of sins. Owen defends this in his early writing. By the early 1650s, he's denouncing this as a very serious error as he comes to appreciate the necessity of the satisfaction of Christ, which becomes one of the great controlling principles of his later writing. But the Duty of Pastors and People Distinguished is a great text for statements like this. He that builds his faith upon preachers, though they preach nothing but truth, and he pretend to believe it, has indeed no faith at all, but a wavering foundation built on a rotten foundation. Someone preaches the truth to you and you believe it because of the preacher, that's a rotten foundation. And so Owen is really pressing upon his listeners the necessity for themselves to search the scriptures, to come to their conclusions, and to really make sense of those conclusions for themselves. What this reflects, of course, is that big theme in early congregational history, the rise of the laity. Who are these people who are coming up and taking responsibility for themselves? And in his early writing, remember, coming out of this period of ecclesiastical anarchy, civil war, horrors, mass violence, mass death, extraordinary ecclesiastical disorder, Owen's responding to this by emphasising the necessity, the duty of individual Christians, even in this time of ruin of the church, to take on teaching responsibilities. So there is a necessity, Owen argues, for these Christians in these completely messed up congregations and this wildly chaotic ecclesiastical, social, political, military environment to begin to take responsibility. If no one is teaching them, in a collapsed and corrupted state of the church, he says, when the ordinary teachers are either utterly ignorant and cannot, or negligent and will not perform their duty, gifts in any one to be a teacher, and consent in others by him to be taught, are a sufficient warrant for the performance of preaching. If you've got a gift, think about the responsibility, he says, that comes with that gift. So Owen's early thinking about the church, it's reactive to the circumstances in which it's developed, is often extremely pragmatic. He's maybe not yet in a position necessarily to think in an extremely principled way about the church. And maybe a great example of this is a preface he writes to this book in 1656. The Private Christian's Non Ultra is the title, or a plea for the layman's interpreting the scriptures. And this is a book that Owen recommends, which encourages ordinary Christians to gather together to study the Bible on their own. If they can't find someone to teach them, gather together yourselves. Study the scriptures yourselves. And it's quite an extraordinary set of claims in some ways that the book makes, but listen to what Owen writes in his preface. The author, Philolaeoclerus, that's not his real name, by the way. That's not a name common in 17th century England. Though Philolaeoclerus build not on those principles which in church affairs I own as the mind of God and proceed upon, and though he doesn't extend the privilege and duty then asserted to their just liberty and compass, nevertheless, Owen says, I'm recommending this book to you. This is a book, Owen says, that's got a really good idea. You're responsible to study the Bible. Even if no one's going to teach you, do it. But Owen says, even this book doesn't go far enough. What does the author's name mean? All you Grecians in the room, how would you translate this? The word clerus, of course, we noticed yesterday. It's in the preface to the Cotton Skis of the Kingdom. Who is the clergy? Who is the clerus? Philo, does anyone know Philo? Leo? So you can construct it how you like. It's someone who loves the clergy, who are the people. Yeah? The people are the clergy. The lover of the people, who are the clergy. So Owen then moves into this great statement of congregational theory, where really his principles become hard and fast in the Savoy documents in 1658, the Declaration, which we've been talking about with Martin, and the accompanying institution of churches and the order appointed in them by Jesus Christ, which is a kind of separate platform which accompanies this book. So just as the Westminster Assembly had created its statement of church government as a subsidiary or an associated document, so in Savoy, a decade later, the Divines published their Declaration of Faith and make their discussion of church order separate from that. It's not part of the confession. And that, of course, is, as Doug points out in his writing, that is where the Baptists begin to change things, because they elevate what's here a subsidiary set of ideas about church government and place it into the confession itself. This is something they want to confess in a confessional document. We'll look at that a little bit in a second. Now, yesterday, Martin and I both mentioned in different ways the extraordinary eschatological impulse that's driving so much congregational innovation in the 1640s and 50s. And the Savoy Declaration still retains this enthusiasm, because it takes the Westminster chapter on the church and it adds this paragraph. As the Lord in his care and love towards his church has, in his infinite wise providence, exercised it with great variety in all ages for the good of them that love him in his own glory, so, according to his promise, we expect that in the latter days, Antichrist being destroyed, the Jews called, the adversaries of the kingdom of his dear Son broken, and the churches of Christ being enlarged and edified through a free and plentiful communication of light and grace, they shall enjoy in this world a more quiet, peaceable, and glorious condition than they've ever had before. So Savoy takes part in this great eschatological impulse. The world is changing. The keys are being returned to the people who should have them. The Spirit is using the church in ways that's not yet happened. And Savoy encapsulates this paragraph. It's not in Westminster, and curiously, when the Baptists come to revise this in 1677, they remove it. And we might want to think about why later on. Of course, we know the Savoy documents were very influential in the 1677 confession. Some of the paragraphs are literally lifted word for word between these two documents 20 years apart. The theory of powers is more or less the same as far as I can trace it. I'm in no way an expert on ecclesiology, but I do notice the repetition of the word power power from the Father, given to the Son, given to the congregation, power then which comes to elders, as we'll see in Owen's writing later on. Now, there's also some very important differences between the Savoy documents and the Baptist revision, and one of those is there in chapter 12. Savoy says the essence of this call of a pastor, teacher, or elder to this office consists in the election of the church, and so on and so on and so on. It has that tripartite division of elders, pastors, teachers, or ruling elders. When the Baptists come to revise this, as you know, they simply cut this out, strike it through, and replace it with bishops and deacons. Not pastors, teachers, and elders, simply bishops, one descriptive term describing these three roles. Now, as Martin's reminded us, some of the differences between Savoy and 1677 reflect the purpose of Savoy and the very different purpose of the 1677 Baptist Confession of Faith. Savoy has this national character. It's in some ways a government document. It's designed to create some kind of parameters for churches, but also for those like Owen who are involved in assessing government-sponsored preachers who may or may not want to work or be called to work within the congregational churches. And so here on the left, you've got the Savoy document talking about someone being approved by lawful ways and means in the providence of God called hereunto. And then the Baptists revised this in 1677 simply by saying they will be called and approved by the church. Why does Savoy not do that? Because it's not the church that's approving preachers. It's these government-sponsored, government-controlled committees of triers and ejectors, which Owen sets up and participates in, who are involved in this. And yet when the Baptists come to consider this, they realise that it's really the duty of churches and responsibility of churches rather than government to do this. Okay, where is Owen going to church in the 1650s? We've got an entire decade of his life when he's writing these magnificent books about communion with God, temptation, mortification of sin. Where's he going to church? We don't know. Is he a member of a church? We don't know. There's absolutely no records. The first record we get of Owen attending church, in the sense of being a member of a church in the 1650s, is when this congregation gets set up in the house of a man called Charles Fleetwood. The house is called Wallingford House. Charles Fleetwood, a very senior military man in Cromwell's army, and when things are getting very iffy politically at the end of the 1650s, Charles Fleetwood becomes one of the great poster boys really of the Republican influence within the army, and he then convenes this congregation in his house, Wallingford House. And who comes to preach at Owen's installation? Philip Nye, and there are the notes of the sermon that Philip Nye is preaching at Owen's installation in Wallingford House. I'm going to show you quite a lot of documents. I'm trying really, really hard to compete with Matt Bingham in his PowerPoint. So I'm using colour and things like that. And then at the end of the 1650s, of course, we know the Republic collapses, not because of outside pressure, but because of internal contradictions. It simply can't hold itself together. And the Republic collapses, and the king comes back into this political vacuum, and all the great institutions of the established church begin to be revived again. And Owen, like lots of other dissenters, are pushed into this very ambiguous legal position of dissent. The laws begin to be passed that limit where they can travel, where they can meet, how many people they can meet with. Someone mentioned yesterday, I forget who, that 2,000 people, ministers and school teachers being ejected from the national church, which is a huge proportion of the clergy of the Church of England are going into dissent, but hardly any of their lay people follow them. So dissent is represented much more in terms of teachers, preachers, than ordinary church people. But what do you do when you've been part of a gathered congregation meeting joyfully for worship and the celebration of the Lord's Supper, and all of a sudden you can't meet together anymore? Maybe we had a kind of a taste of that during COVID, didn't we? But these people are dealing with it with massive legislation coming behind them. How can we celebrate the Lord's Supper together as a covenanted congregation if we can't meet together. And one of the ideas that begins to be debated is, let's subdivide, let's meet in smaller units of a bigger congregation. Can we do that? And Philip Nye, in the manuscript you can see in front of you there, says no, you've got to hold together. You can't just break into smaller units and pretend you are churches. So what happens? The godly begin to form conventicles. So in Fleetwood House, which I just mentioned, Charles Fleetwood, the house which he later becomes owner of, a different house now, also becomes a centre of conventicle activity. And in the early 1660s, that house, Fleetwood House, becomes the meeting place of congregations listening to preachers like Henry Danvers, one of the great particular Baptist preachers of the period. And the owner of that house, or rather the son of the owner of that house, Sir John Hartop, begins to take extensive notes on preachers that he is listening to in these very early years, very early months actually, of Restoration. And fascinatingly, not only is his house, Fleetwood House, the location for preaching by particular Baptist minister Henry Danvers, but Sir John Hartop also begins to take extensive notes, 120 pages plus, of sermons delivered by Benjamin Cox and Hansard Knowles. Anyone heard of these individuals? Significant individuals. And these are individuals who Hartop is listening to. These sermon notes had never been published. How do you think Benjamin Cox was responding to the collapse of the Republic and the massive religious restrictions that followed it? Well, we need someone to come to Queen's or maybe Union Martin and do a PhD and find out. That would be great. But I mention this because the Hartop home, Fleetwood House, where Henry Danvers is preaching, where Sir John Hartop is taking notes on Benjamin Cox, begins to be the home of a fellowship led by an even more significant individual. And that's a fellowship led by John Owen himself. So after the Restoration, Owen begins to think about church order in very, very difficult times. And he writes 2 extended discussions of church order in this period. 1667, A Brief Instruction in the Worship of God. That's typically the shortened title. The full title adds, And Discipline of the Churches of the New Testament. And Owen is writing this book in Fleetwood House, when his congregation numbers no more than 30 people who are sneaking into that house church to listen to his preaching, to celebrate the Lord's Supper together, to encourage each other, when some of them have lost everything. When I say they've lost everything, let me give you this example. About half of their members are men, and about half of those men in the previous decade had roles either governing England as one of the members of the Council of State or governing Ireland. They had massive responsibility. One of them, Charles Fleetwood, managed to retain a lot of his wealth and use that sacrificially to gather these people together when they were finally being released from prison. One individual who had formerly been one of the major generals, one of the 12 major generals running England for 18 months, who had lived in the palace of the Bishop of Lincoln after the Restoration, finally gets out of jail and has lost everything and rushes to his friends in Stoke Newington, where this house was, to find work as a market gardener so he could live together with his old friends in this religious community. So Owen is pastor of a small house church of around 30 people when he writes A Brief Instruction in the Worship of God. And then much later on, at the very end of his life in 1682, but only published in 1689, a second work comes out, The True Nature of a Gospel Church and Its Government. And this is a book, a much more complex book in some ways, a much more programmatic book about church order that draws upon sermons, we think, preached by Owen in the last months of his life, when he's just come through a crisis in his congregation, and when he's in a much, much bigger congregation with many more agendas at play and a much more complex leadership structure, as we'll see in a moment. I love A Brief Instruction in the Worship of God. It's one of my favourite Owen books. And it's significant, I think, because it doesn't extract church order and deal with it as a thing in itself. It begins with worship. And it begins by asking the big questions. Why are we Christians? We are Christians because God wants worshippers. The Father seeks those who will come and worship him. And so Owen then develops this idea of worship, and then begins to move from the idea of worship, how should we worship, into this idea of where should we worship? And his big idea in this book is that we worship in the congregations that are filled by the Holy Spirit. Unto this covenant are the institutions of gospel worship annexed, and unto that administration of it which is granted unto the church upon the coming and death of Christ. So what's it all about? What's this worship all about? How do we build ourselves up in our most holy faith? We seek communion with God in Jesus Christ, and we jointly celebrate the ordinances of God's worship. What are these ordinances? The duty of the church, and consequently every member of it, he says, is to search the Scriptures, to inquire into the mind of Christ, to find out whatever is appointed by him. What's he asking you to do, this one who has saved you and brought you into his fellowship? What's he asking you to do? And Owen says, go and read your Bible, find out what he'd like you to do. And why is it so important to worship him in the way that he wants? Look at this quotation. It's an extraordinary quotation from volume 15, A Brief Instruction in the Worship of God. Owen says, listen, there's a ton of things God asks you to do that no one will ever see. The world will never know how much you resist temptation. There's other things that the world must not see. They mustn't see you praying in street corners. Jesus says, go into your room and shut the door. Do it privately. But the world does see you going to church. It can come into your meetings. It can see what church is like. Just as the angels look upon the church at worship, so people from the world around you, your next door neighbour, can walk in, and you can give extraordinary glory to God when you're worshipping him in the way that he deserves. Why else is worship important? Owen reminds us in this book, because it matters to the ascended Christ. And he's thinking here of Revelation 2 and 3, of the ascended Christ walking among the candlesticks, inspecting his churches, and showing what he can approve of, and reproving those that he can't. Remember the words of the Apostle Paul. I received from the Lord. When? After his ascension. I received from the Lord that which I delivered to you. And what was it that the ascended Jesus gave to Paul? But instructions about worship. Do this in memory of me. What is a church? Well, a brief instruction defines it in the way that by now in the conference we're all completely used to. A society of persons called out of the world or their natural worldly state by the administration of the word and spirit unto the obedience of the faith or the knowledge and worship of God in Christ, joined together in a holy band. I'm not going to make a joke about Christian rock. Or by special agreement for the exercise of the communion of saints and the due observation of all the ordinances of the gospel. What constitutes a church? How does this holy band become a church? There constitutes a church and interested in the rights, power and privileges of the gospel church by the will, promise, authority and law of Jesus Christ upon their own voluntary consent and engagement to walk together in the due subjection of their souls and consciences unto his authority as their king, priest and prophet. He alone, Jesus alone, has authority to erect such a society. You can't just start a church. You just can't do it. It's Jesus himself who plants it, who builds it, who waters it, all of these things. He is the builder of this house, Hebrews 3, as well as Lord over it. And the church is a place of freedom. Another big theme in a brief instruction. A church state is in a state of absolute liberty under Christ. Not for men to do what they will, but to do their duty freely without compulsion. So there is liberty, and the place of the church is the place that the Spirit dwells, where the Spirit dwells, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. But the church needs authority. And so Owen begins to explain that these elders that he's been talking about have power. Now the Presbyterians have been getting a really hard time, so I'm not going to add to that by emphasising that I've got 4 Ps to deliver in this next part of what I want to say. 4 Ps. Elders of power. And here Owen begins to explain that all church power is originally vested in Jesus Christ. God the Father gives it to the Son, Jesus, and entrusts him with it for the accomplishment of his work of mediation. And then secondly, Jesus, the Lord Jesus, then communicates this authority by way of trust, to be exercised by them in his name unto persons by him appointed, so much as is needful for the ordering and disposing of all things in his churches unto the blessed ends he has appointed. Elders of power. That power or authority which is given unto the elders of the church does not first formally reside in the body of the church unorganized or distinct from them, though they are called unto their office by their suffrage and choice, but they are themselves as such the first subject of office power, for so is the will of the Lord Christ. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. I'm not sure I totally understand what's happening here. I wonder, is Owen beginning to put some critical distance between himself and Savoy? I'm not sure. Others can advise. Elders of power, elders of parity. He who is a pastor or a teacher is also a bishop or overseer, a presbyter or elder, a guide or ruler, a minister, a servant of the church for the Lord's sake. They may have different names, but they're all elders, and they have parity with each other. They have particular roles. The office of them that are teachers is one and the same among them all, but where there are many in the same church, it's the will of Christ that they should be particularly assigned unto such special work as their gifts suggest they're best suited to. There are many names that are equally accommodated unto all that are partakers of it. As elders, bishops, guides, they're all alike elders, alike bishops, alike guides. They have one office in common amongst them, and every one the whole entire unto himself. But they are distinguished by their work and employment in the discharge of that office. Such are pastors and teachers, others are ruling elders, but while the roles are particular, they have parity with each other. And no matter what their differences are, though some are pastors, all have pastoral responsibility. Sorry, I missed up that slide. So not all elders are pastors or teachers. Some are ruling elders. 1 Timothy 5, of course, the classic passage in that. And Owen is emphasizing here that the difference in the churches, as Jesus establishes them, is not a difference between clergy and laity. That's the distinction of the Church of England, between clergy and laity. The difference in the congregational churches is the distinction between officers and members. And the reason, Owen suggests, is because the whole church is God's clergy. Remember that word kleros again from 1 Peter. It's come up again and again in our discussions. It's there in Cotton's Keys. It's there in other parts of Owen's writing. The whole church, he says, is God's clergy. The distinction is not between those who are specially set apart for worship and those who are not. The distinction is between those who are elders or deacons and those who are ordinary members. A distinction of office rather than a distinction of status. And finally, Owen says at the end of a brief instruction, churches should be confessional. Whereas all the churches have all of them one common faith, and all are obliged to hold forth and declare it to all men as they have opportunity, then he says if God gave opportunity, they should join together in declaring and testifying their joint consent and fellowship in the same doctrine of faith, expressed in a form of sound words. Owen in 1667, the churches sharing a common faith should express it in a single form of sound words. What is that single form of sound words he has in mind? Well, we know from other parts of his writing in this period, when he is quoting the Savoy Declaration. So that's all simple. That's all tied up. That all makes sense. Let's fast forward 10, 12 years to the end of the 1670s. Now, Owen is no longer the pastor of a small house church. His small house church congregation of 30 has merged with a much bigger, much more public congregation, formerly led by Joseph Carroll. There's maybe 170, rising up to maybe 200, maybe even 220 people in this much bigger church. And it's much, much more complicated. The situation in which Owen is preaching and leading the people of God is now critical. Charles II, the king, has 14 illegitimate children, but no legitimate sons. His religious convictions have always been a bit of a worry for the dissenters. But now, as he is growing older and older with no male successor to pass the throne to, the successor to the throne is Charles's brother, James, the Duke of York, who since 1673 has been outed as a Catholic. So for the first time since the English Reformation, the English Protestant nation has to come to terms with the fact that the heir to the throne is a Catholic. What's going to happen next? Is that the end of the Reformation? And then there's a congregational crisis that Owen's got to deal with. In December 1679, being aware of the really horrific persecution of the Scottish Covenanters, and watching some of the really horrific disturbances that are happening in New England, Owen decides that the only thing that can be done to preserve the peace and security of the people of God in his church is for them to come together formally to renew their congregational covenant. It's the only thing they can do to renew themselves to their commitments to stave off the impending judgment of God. And the congregation says no. He's been teaching them, guys, you've got the keys. You're a congregation with power. And then they say, we're going to use that to resist you. And Owen doesn't know what to do. We'll think a little bit more about this tomorrow. There's a real crisis when his ministry is only enabled by voluntary consent and adherence. When he calls his congregation to renew their covenant and they say, no, we're not going to do it, what happens next? And thirdly, there's another incredibly significant challenge Owen's got to face with. He's just preached through Hebrews. He's just come to that really sharp distinction between the old and new covenants that means he can no longer sign up to not just the Westminster idea of one covenant of grace and multiple dispensations, but the Savoy's statement of one covenant of grace and multiple dispensations. And Owen, in his Hebrews commentary, explicitly says that position is wrong. Which means that, as a consequence of preaching through the Bible, Owen has come to the position where, having adhered to the 39 Articles to be a priest in the Church of England, having submitted to the Westminster Assembly's examination to become a parish minister in Essex, having written, as Martin reminded us, statements of faith for a national church settlement in the 1650s, having signed up to the Savoy Declaration, he is ultra-confessional. And now there's none he can sign. So what's he going to do? How does church order work when you've committed yourself to this way of viewing what a church should be, and now it doesn't work anymore? What's he going to do? He preaches to his congregation what a church ought to be. And so the true nature of a gospel church, which is licensed in 10th of June 1688, published in the following spring in 89, comes from sermons, we think, which are being preached in the immediate aftermath of this crisis in his church, when he has to remind his own congregation what biblical church order ought to look like. Now, you can see this process at work. Zach and Martin and I, when we were working through the unpublished sermons, one of the things that we were really excited to discover is how much of Owen's published work begins as sermons. You think of the Hebrews commentary, that began life as sermons to that house group of 30 people. And his books on the Holy Spirit, they begin as sermons to that house group of 30 people. Owen had such high expectations of what a distressed, persecuted, marginalised, legally vulnerable group of people could do with the Bible, what they need from the Bible to keep going in that situation. But now he's got to persuade his church of Congregationalism. And so in volume 9, we've got a sermon preached at an unknown ordination, probably not in his congregation, but it becomes a chapter and you've got the references there on the screen, it becomes a chapter in the true nature of the gospel church. And so we surmise, I think legitimately, that this is a book that is reflecting his pulpit ministry as he tries to remind the people what church order actually looks like. We know from Chauncey's introduction to the book that Owen corrected the manuscript before his death in August 1683. We may ask the question then, why was it not licensed for publication till 10th of June 1688? And then why was it not published for a further 6-9 months in the early years of 1689? The true nature of the gospel church is a work on ecclesiology written in and for a time of crisis. Owen dies in August 1683. Remember what happens next. Charles II dies. He's followed by James II, who becomes the first Catholic king of England since the Reformation. The Protestants can cope with that because he's only got 2 daughters, and both of them are Protestants. One of them is married to William of Orange. And then on the 10th of June, 1688, where have you heard that date before? On the 10th of June, 1688, James II's wife gives birth to a boy, which means that what could have been a temporary Catholic monarchy has just turned into a permanent Catholic dynasty. It is the single worst day for English Protestants since the Reformation began. The Reformation, functionally now, as of the 10th of June 1688, is over. What happened on the 10th of June 1688? Owen's book was licensed for publication. So when we say this is a book written in a time of crisis, that is the level of crisis in which it is licensed to appear. Now, it doesn't get published for 6 or 9 months later, and maybe if you read the Banner Truth edition, the Gould edition, you read the preface to this, and it looks hilarious. Chauncey, who is one of Owen's co-pastors in the Leadenhall Street Church, is preserving his writing, and he obviously gets this license for publication on the 10th of June 1688, and then he watches as all of the deliverance that the Congregationalists had been predicting 40 years before suddenly happens. The church goes through this crisis and is suddenly released. Why? Because in November, James's daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange land in Torquay and Devon, and they begin the revolution that drives James from the throne and establishes a Protestant constitutional monarchy, which continued until fairly recently in the United Kingdom. So that's the context for the true nature of the gospel church. It's a time of utter crisis for not only Owen's congregation, but also for English Protestants generally. So how does this book respond to the crisis? Well, remember, a couple of slides ago, we saw how Philip Nye had to address that question. Can a church subdivide in a time of crisis to maintain the ordinances of Christ in some form of worship, life of worship together? And Nye had said, no, even in a time of persecution, you can't do that. You can't just subdivide the church. You've got to stick together. But listen, Owen has loved his time, I think, of being the pastor of that house church of 30 people. And when he suddenly becomes responsible for this much larger congregation that meets in Leadenhall Street, he's got one ruling elder he's inherited from Joseph Carroll, and it's him. There's only 2 of them to look after this congregation of 170 growing to 220 people. And so one of the very first things Owen does, and he does it again and again in these unpublished sermons, is to encourage people to meet in small groups for prayer and fellowship together. He's not going to be with them. They're going to do it on their own. They're going to meet in small groups to worship through prayer and to fellowship together. In 1682, in the true nature of the gospel church, Owen comes back to that concept and says this: wherever there are 2 or 3 of these believers, right or power is granted unto them to meet together in the name of Christ for mutual edification, to exhort, instruct, admonish one another, or to pray together. So Owen takes these small group fellowships, which he's always encouraged for the purposes of mutual fellowship and encouragement, and now in this moment of utter crisis in 1682, he looks back at these tiny groups spread around London and the area that meet together as, what would we call them, cell groups, small groups, and he just drops this hint. Each one of you could become a church on your own. Now, even in this time of crisis, and maybe because of the crisis in the congregation, the true nature of a gospel church comes a bit harder at the idea of a congregational covenant. You really need to take this seriously. One, of course, has just come through the crisis where the church has said, no, we're not going to do it. We'll talk this afternoon and explain how maybe that crisis was ultimately resolved. And so in the true nature of a gospel church, Owen is really emphasising the need for these covenants. Now, if you read Jim's book, Edification and Beauty, you'll see that lots of Baptist churches, well, some Baptist churches in this period didn't have covenants. So the agreement to worship together, to serve together, is implicit. Owen wants it to be explicit. Really takes that seriously in the true nature of a gospel church. And he says these churches, these nuclei of little fellowship groups, they shouldn't stay unformed. They need to form. They need to have officers. They need to have mutual agreements. And they need to come into a church state so that they can do all the things that Jesus wants them to do as his worshippers. And so he begins to talk about officers, begins to talk about elders, begins again to use those P's, elders of power. Owen is great for these moments of utter clarity. How about this one? If men would but a little seriously consider what there is in that care of souls, even of all them over whom they pretend church power, rule, or jurisdiction, and what it would mean to give an account concerning them before the judgment seat of Christ, it would abate their earnestness in wanting bigger and bigger churches. You will find, Owen says, when you come to stand before the chief shepherd to give an account, it'll be really helpful if you know everyone's name. Elders of power and responsibility, they have parity. We've talked about this before. Again, he emphasises that claim. Their roles are particular. Some are pastors, some are teachers, some are ruling elders. Pastors have the ability to preach, also to dispense the sacraments. Teachers are there literally to teach, but also as elders, but they don't dispense the sacraments. And there are rulers who neither teach nor dispense the sacraments, but all are elders and all work together. Not all elders are pastors, but all elders have a pastoral responsibility. Think about the context I've just described to you in 1682. That is the context for Owen making this remark. Jesus' whole flock in this world are a company of tempted ones. His own life on the earth he calls the time of his temptation. And those who have the charge of his flock under him ought to have a sense of their infirmities and endeavour in an especial manner to succour them that are tempted. So Owen says elders can be pastors or teachers or rulers, but they're all elders. He said elders have plurality, parity, particularity, different types of roles, and power. He says in A True Guide to the Gospel Church, the ideal church leadership team, he says, should be one pastor, supported by teachers and ruling elders. They're all elders, but one pastor, as many teachers as you need, as many ruling elders as you need, supported by deacons, as many as you need. And then interestingly, he gives this sort of mathematical statement that really for every 10 families, you ought to have one elder. But must these churches be confessional? And in 1682, there's no longer a confession that Owen can sign up to. His position had changed in 1667. Remember how he closes a brief instruction in the worship of God with that really strong call for churches to share a common confession. By the early 1680s, having preached through Hebrews, there's no confession really available to him to sign. The confession that's nearest to his position on the covenants is the confession created by the Baptists in 1677. But Owen's thinking doesn't end there, because a few years after that, 1692, a little book gets published, A Guide to Church Fellowship and Order According to the Gospel Institution. It's a short book, really just a pamphlet. I came across it really through this catalogue of books, of Owen's books from the 1690s, that's in a library in Dublin. And here in the back of this catalogue, item 28 in the catalogue is A Guide to Church Fellowship and Order According to the Gospel Institution. And you'll notice there it's 6p, 6d. Those that are so charitable to dispose of them to young persons shall have them for 5 shillings a dozen, so it's cheap. The book was widely sold, but it wasn't included in Gould's edition. I suspect nobody here has read it. It's only been reprinted once. And while the first chapters of this book, A Guide to Church Fellowship and Order, depend upon the true nature of a gospel church, the later chapters differ. And that, of course, raises the big question that Zach took us to yesterday. How do we read these books that come out after Owen's death? We don't know really too much about their points of origin. And there's some really unexpected moves that Owen makes in this little pamphlet, A Guide to Church Fellowship and Order. His emphasis in this publication is really strongly on the idea of edification. Churches, he says, are not sacred machines, as some suppose, erected and acted for the outward interest and advantages of any sort of men, but only means of the edification of believers, which they are bound to make use of in obedience unto the commands of Christ, and not otherwise. Owen says that ministers and churches are nothing but instituted means of the conversion of sinners and the edification of believers. When any of them through their own default cease so to be, there is no obligation unto any man to join or continue in their communion, nor do they contract any guilt in a peaceable departure from these churches. But actually, as Christians, needing edification, they discharge their duty. This should be done peaceably, without strife or contention, without judging of others, with love and compassion and prayer. Such a practice at present would fall under severe charges and accusations, and also brutish penalties in some places. But when all church craft shall be defeated, and the uses that are made of its imaginary authority be discarded, there will be little occasion of this practice, and none at all of offence. So, it's been republished once, that's today. Doug has the first ever copy. I did get one delivered, unfortunately it went to the address in Ireland. I was hoping to bring it out with a flourish and sell it, but no, that couldn't happen. And also the QR code doesn't work, so there's no point taking a picture of the screen. So, I mean, it's a letdown in all kinds of ways. If you'd like a copy of this, you can get a Kindle version on Amazon, or email me if you want a PDF. And I think also Amazon is set up to do like a printed version for like $4 or $5. The Kindle is 99 cents. It's as little as it possibly can be. If 99 cents, you think that's a bit hard, you want to negotiate, email me, and you know, as long as I get my lunch, I'll be very happy to send one back to you. Owen lives through times of enormous trial, and I think he'd want us to leave with this conviction from a true nature of a gospel church. When we say under a deep sense of our own weakness, who is sufficient for these things? He doth say, Jesus says, my grace is sufficient for you. Thank you very much.